Since the dawn of the universe,
Boom. Explosion.
there has been a single concept that has tied a sacred bond between stoners, hipsters, uncles, your dad, and sexy girls who wear shirts with triangles on it. Pink Floyd. People who have partaken of the forbidden fruit of Pink Floyd have been known to never return to other music. But how could they? Does other music have angry Scottish men screaming at you to eat your meat? No. Does it even have any screaming at all? No. Does it have 23-minute songs that take up half an album? If not, then what's the deal? Anyway, today we're going to be ranking every Pink Floyd album from worst to best. Well, you're not actually going to be ranking them, just me. Before we jump into ranking though, let's briefly go over the album timeline for Pink Floyd. In 1963, Roger Waters, Nick Mason, Richard Wright, and 3 random people I can't find pictures of on the internet created a band called Sigma 6. Later renamed to the Megadeths, later renamed to the Arabs, later renamed to the Screaming Arabs, later renamed to Leonard's Lodgers, later renamed to the Spectrum 5, later renamed to the T-Set, which would be the final name they keep forever. Later renamed to the Pink Floyd sound, later renamed to Pink Floyd. Also, Syd Barrett's here now, those 3 random people left, and it's 1965 now. Man, I'm good at telling stories. Pink Floyd's first 2 albums were led by Syd Barrett and released in 1967 and 1968. We'll call this the psychedelic period of albums. During this period, Barrett took a shit ton of drugs and would sporadically refuse to play one on stage. Either that or repeat one note on the guitar over and over and over again and ignore everything else in the world. After those 2 albums, Syd Barrett was kicked out of the band, for some crazy reason, because it turned out having a psycho as a band member was not healthy for the band dynamic. With Syd gone and being replaced by David Gilmour, Roger Waters took over being the main writer, and we had a bit of an awkward transition phase that slowly got more and more developed between 1969 and 1972. We'll just call this the transition period. Pink Floyd started to get mass public attention in 1973 with their album The Dark Side of the Moon, and then continued what's considered a golden age of albums that lasted between 1973 and 1979. Richard Wright left the band after this album. Well, technically he was kicked out by Waters for not pulling his weight, and then Roger Waters himself left the band some years later in 1985, but not before releasing one last album that compiled some cut songs from The Wall with some new tracks called The Final Cut in 1983. This is literally the only album from this period, so we'll just call this period literally just the Final Cut period. Pink Floyd was basically dead at this point, but the remaining members got back together and continued to use the name in 1987, despite their main writer being gone. Waters wasn't happy about this at the time, but has since regretted his saltiness. At this point, Richard Wright also slipped back in because, Waters wasn't there to say no anymore. This period was led by David Gilmour and lasted off and on between 1987 and 2014, and we'll just call it the Gilmour period. Alright, cool, there's all the albums. Now I'm gonna rank them for your entertainment. 3, 2, 1, go. Number 15, The Endless River. Released in 2014, The Endless River is an almost entirely instrumental, reminiscent finale album to Pink Floyd. The only song that has lyrics on the album is the final song, Louder Than Words. The album uses a good chunk of ideas dropped from The Division Bell and sort of tries to recapture the feel of Pink Floyd's golden age. And that attempt shows. A lot of the instrumental tracks here sound like they could have been on Wish You Were Here or Dark Side of the Moon, but the album also definitely plays things safe in doing that. Maybe even too safe. Like, some of the instrumental tracks here sound, I think, too similar to their inspirations, to the point where they sound like off-brand versions of existing Pink Floyd songs. Sort of like the background music they would use in a Pink Floyd documentary that couldn't afford the rights to the actual music, so they use sound-alikes. Also, and this part is somewhat preference, but what I like about Pink Floyd instrumental is that it builds up to the singing and improves its impact. But without singing being all that present in this album, that feeling is lost. It's like listening to Shine On You Crazy Diamonds, but instead of ever building up to that first verse, it just keeps going and then transitions into the next song. It's got that build up without that final oomph that I think makes for a good Pink Floyd song. In the end, I can't really recommend this album, but I also can't really 100% reject it. I think it checks a very specific mark for me, and that is I'm studying and sick of lo-fi beats right now and want to mix up my background music. In that very specific situation, this album works for me. Besides that, I don't feel all that inclined to give this a re-listen ever. Number 14. More. Alright, More isn't the worst album, but it is the second worst. Number 13. I'm just kidding. More is kind of weird because it's barely an album. It's actually a movie soundtrack that Pink Floyd wrote as a side project for the movie also called More, which is fittingly a movie about kids doing drugs. The album was cracked out and somewhat improvised in only 2 weeks with a really tight budget, and I think these factors show. It's pretty uneventful to say the least. There's a good couple songs like Green is the Color and Crying Song, which are surprisingly pretty nice and mellow, but overall there's just not much to say on this one. It's just kind of boring for me at least. Number 13, Umaguma, or Amagama. I don't know, I've heard it said both ways, but I also found this video of Roger Waters saying it like so I'll stick to that. Anyway, discounting the side project of More, Umaguma is the first real attempt at a full album after Sid's complete departure, and the execution of this was a little strange. First of all, they decided to make it a double album, which is already inherently risky because you have to fill up twice as much space. Second of all, they decided to make record 1 of the album a live album, which is kind of weird because live albums and studio albums are generally kept separate, but I can forgive this because the live half of Umaguma is actually really good, especially their live version of Careful With That Axe, Eugene, which I would argue is more passionate and engaging than the original recording itself, and also a little scary. Now, record 2 is, well, experimental to say the least, and I will say that the experimentation is at least interesting. Like, this weird instrumental freak folk is not really like anything else you've heard before, but it also kind of lacks direction. Like, maybe they were so focused on the question of could they make a 5-minute track of them making chaotic animal noises with their mouths, that they never asked should they make a 5-minute track of them making chaotic animal noises with their mouths. And yes, that's a real song on the album, and it's rightfully called Several Species of Small Furry Animals Gathered Together in a Cave and Grooving with a Pict. Anyway, final verdict, an alright live album followed by 47 minutes of chaos that's honestly at least interesting. Like, I would recommend listening to this album at least once when you're in the mood to be confused and scared. Also, it has a really cool album cover, and I know that shouldn't affect my opinion, but it does. It's really neat. Look at its infinite zoom. Number 12, A Momentary Lapse of Reason. With this one, we're jumping quite a bit of time forward from the previous 2 albums. However, the story we have here is very much a reflection of Umaguma. With Umaguma, you had Roger Waters taking over as main writer due to Syd Barrett's departure. Now, here, with A Momentary Lapse of Reason, we have David Gilmour taking over the role due to Waters' departure. And honestly, given that situation, this album isn't bad and it has some good songs, but it falls painfully short in a couple of ways for me. For one, this album doesn't feel like a Pink Floyd album. And that makes sense. Although he obviously didn't carry 100% of the band altogether, Waters was a very big contributor of the Pink Floyd sound, and Gilmour struggled in the album making process without him. Secondly, while previous Pink Floyd albums had what I consider to be a very timeless sound, A Momentary Lapse of Reason very much sounds a part of its time. What I mean is that it is very 80s. Drum machines, synth leads, and all that wacky-tacky jazz make this album deviate very, very far from the sound of previous Pink Floyd albums. Now, bias alert, I'm already not a huge fan of that 80s sound, so going into this album, I already kind of disliked it from the start, but I also think that most of us can agree that the 80s sound doesn't really fit Pink Floyd. Also, I should mention that this is the first album in a very long time to not be a concept album. While a lot of the songs are like still thematically linked, this album doesn't really flow from song to song to tell a story like most Pink Floyd albums are known for. In the end, the album probably should have remained as Gilmour's 3rd solo album, which was the initial plan. Anyway, next. Number 11, The Division Bell. This was one of the 4 Pink Floyd albums to reach number 1 on the charts, with the other 3 being Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and The Wall. So based solely on popularity and sales numbers, you would think that this is some sort of amazing Renaissance album that brings Pink Floyd right back to the golden age. And for some people, this album is that. To me, it's not. To me, this album is an uninspired cash grab that abuses the commercial success of Pink Floyd and replicates it without soul to bank on people's nostalgia of the band in its golden age. Saying that out loud sounds really, really hipstery, but honestly, I feel like they jumped into this album going, okay, Pink Floyd is all about guitar solos and this sort of sound and this sort of build, and this is what people want and expect. And then they just did that. They followed that script to the point I don't feel any emotion in the songs. I get that this is the only post-Waters album that gets things as close as possible to the golden age, but it honestly just doesn't do it for me. And despite it being the best Gilmour album, I doubt I'll ever be inspired to listen to it again, unless it's to reassess. But for now, in my headcanon, all this album is the best of the worst. For me. Number 10, The Final Cut. This extremely Wall-esque album was actually initially conceived to be the film's soundtrack for the Wall film, but eventually that was dropped and it became its own thing. The Wall inspirations are still very obvious though. A lot of these songs have the same operatic building sound that the Wall had, and I like that sort of song. However, the problem with this album is that, well, every song is like that. The Wall had a lot of diversity in its tracks, with the slow building and operatic Waters sung tracks sort of being these highlights of passion. On the Final Cut, every song is like that, and every song has lead vocals by Waters except for Not Now John, which to me is the track that stands out the most on this album. Besides that exception though, this album is just all very samey, and a lot of the songs are really good, but it's easy to forget that fact when they blend in so easily with every other track on the album. Still a worthwhile listen to me, but the monotony of it makes it feel a bit less complete for me. Number 9, Obscured by Clouds. This album was the last little stop before the Dark Side of the Moon. Similar to More, this album was more of a side project, being a planned soundtrack for a French film. In fact, the album was so much of a side project that they literally made it while they were working on Dark Side of the Moon. But unlike More, this album is surprisingly actually really good for what it is. Now, naturally, due to its origin of being from the side and a planned soundtrack album, it doesn't feel as unison as other albums. Like, little time, I'm sure, was put into perfecting the track list and order, but we actually have a lot of really good tracks here, with a lot of them having the sort of sound that Pink Floyd is generally known for. In all, this album is just way better than it should be. And I know number 9 might seem low, but in reality, this is the first album on the list I would actually be inclined to own. So it's not that this is bad, it's just that all of these are great and I happen to like the rest better. Number 8, A Saucer Full of Secrets. It has always been under my impression that the first 2 Pink Floyd albums were 100% Syd Barrett led. I mean, heck, I even said it in the intro. But it turns out Pink Floyd's second album was pretty much run, sung, and written by everybody. Waters wrote 3 songs, Wright wrote 2, the title track was an improv between everybody, and then Syd Barrett only wrote 1. And I think this album actually really benefits from this collaboration, and with everyone bringing in just a couple of songs, everyone's bringing in their best, and there really isn't any filler. All of the songs here are good, this one's scary, but all the songs are still good. But this kind of rocks my perception of Pink Floyd because I always thought the band struggled after Barrett left. Yet here they were writing kick-ass songs on the second album with very little help from the Syd kid. Great album, underrated album, I am confused. Next, number 7, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Pink Floyd's first album is a difficult one to rank, not because it's bad, in fact I think it's wonderful, but just because it's so different from what people generally think of when they think Pink Floyd. Like, this was Pink Floyd when they were still a Syd Barrett-run LSD band that sang about gnomes. And it's really good, but it's hard to compare to the journeys that were the band's 70s albums. Still, if you have never heard the original Pink Floyd, give it a try. You'll be pleasantly surprised by just how good yet completely different it is. Number 6, Atom Heart Mother. This album is sort of some unexpected mid-period gold, especially when you look at the track list and realize that side 1 is 1 song, and it's instrumental and almost 24 minutes. Looking at that, you would think you're about to have a bad time. But no, this one track is actually really good and engaging. And then on side 2, these few middle tracks are like surprisingly really soft and wholesome and easy listening. And then the final 13 minutes is just like chaotic breakfast noises. But ignoring that, this album is sort of a little hidden gem of good surprises. Give it a try, it's a good time. Number 5, The Wall. Maybe just a bit lower than you expected, but again, everything 9 and up is like platinum best of all time albums for me. It's just when I compare them to each other that it might seem like things are ranked low. But trust me when I say that I still love all of these. Anyway, listening to The Wall, it's easy to tell that Pink Floyd had changed over the past couple albums. You know, like Dark Side was very much trippy LSD space time, listen while you're high, sync with Wizard of the Oz, spin in your uncle's basement, wake up naked on a light pink cloud, post-psychedelic prog rock stuff. But The Wall is more of a really personal and political rock opera about society, and it was led mostly by Waters, which is something that was kind of happening with Animals, was happening even more here, and then went too far with the final cut and, well, kind of broke up the band. Despite that though, the singing, the playing, the lyrics, they're all very passionate on this album, and they really do make you feel something. I would say like especially this little 9-minute golden spot of Brick in the Wall Part 1, Happiest Days of Our Lives, to Part 2 is like iconically the type of music that makes your brain buzz from that build and then that payoff. It fucking rocks. My ADHD brain just doesn't like double albums in general, so it's not something I pick out for listening as often, which is honestly kind of a good thing because you never want to over-listen to a Pink Floyd album. Anyway, in all, maybe a little different than the 2 powerhouses of Pink Floyd, but still undeniably amazing. Number 4, Animals. This album has had an incredible redemption arc for me. Like, in my initial draft of this script, which I wrote in February, I had this ranked as number 8. I was like, alright, this album, not bad, but the songs are too long. And I mean, to be fair, ignoring the minute intro and outro, this album is only 3 songs and all of them are at least 10 minutes. That's like the definition of the Pink Floyd meme of society is bad. But Jesus, was I wrong about this album. This album may only have 3 songs, but those 3 songs are some of the best in the Pink Floyd discography. Pigs especially has made its way up to possibly being my favorite Pink Floyd song. It's so aggressive and cool and menacing. I can see why so many diehard Pink Floyd fans consider this to be their favorite album of the bunch. And this is still now one of my favorite albums of all time, not even just Pink Floyd, but there's just a couple here that I like a little more. Number 3, Metal. Most people think of the holy Pink Floyd trinity as Dark Side, Wish You Were Here, and The Wall, which is valid, but for me, it's Dark Side, Wish You Were Here, and Metal. Like, The Wall is amazing, don't get me wrong, but if you're into the more classic, spacey prog rock stuff that Pink Floyd is known for, Metal fills that hole a lot better. One of These Days is a surprisingly really engaging instrumental track, and that transitions surprisingly well into A Pillow of Wind, which is an uncharacteristically soft and acoustic love song. And that unexpected softness continues for the rest of side 1 with Fearless, San Tropez, and Seamus, an easy listening soft belly that could be compared to Atom Heart Mother. But unlike Atom Heart Mother, instead of ending with chaotic breakfast noises, it ends with one of the trippiest, coolest, and longest Pink Floyd songs ever made, Echoes, which takes up all of side 2 and is what really makes this album tippity top tier for me. Also, I should mention that one demo that was dropped from this album ended up being turned into Brain Damage and Eclipse, which is personally my favorite part of Dark Side of the Moon, so that just goes to show that there was that Dark Side style before Dark Side came to be. Number 2, Wish You Were Here. The sad truth about this album is that, well, it's kind of an underdog. Not because it's bad, in fact it's one of the greatest albums of all time, but because it's not Dark Side of the Moon, which is just incomparably iconic when compared to Wish You Were Here. Like, when it came out, it actually got a lot of bad reviews, probably due to people's incredibly high expectations that were set. You know, they were expecting a darker Side of the Moon to come out, but instead we got something new and a little less accessible. We got longer instrumentals, more personal themes, and a more diverse midsection that I think probably just scared people and threw them off initially. But the truth is that this album still deserves extremely high respect. There's a lot of things to love about this album and a lot of things that set it apart from Dark Side, like its 10 title songs, which have an extremely iconic guitar riff and immersing instrumental that I think honestly offers better deep listening than Dark Side. Like, if I were realistically to ever actually get high and put on a record, I would easily go for this one, not Dark Side. Partly due to the enthralling instrumental, and then, also partly due to the fact that I've heard Dark Side a million times. Anyway, top tier and beloved album of mine that I was even deeply considering putting as my number 1, which, I don't know, I wonder what that one's gonna be, I guess we'll find out. Number 1, Dark Side of the Moon. I can't help putting this at number 1. I know there's plenty of hipsters out there who will tell you that this album is overrated, and I know it's like the album everyone is expecting to be here, but I still love it. I'm not the type of person who can pretend not to like something due to its mass media attention, although I will admit that there is something really special about having a favorite album that isn't as up in front and well known, which is where Metal swoops in for me. But Dark Side of the Moon is at the top of so many lists for a reason. It's iconic and well thought out, even with the introductory song Speak to Me. It might sound like just chaos and screaming on your first listen, but on listen 2, you realize that it's this cool little foreshadowing piece that has a little piece of every song snuck within it. Then you just have so many bangers that flow into one another. Us and Them, Time and Breathe, Brain Damage and Eclipse, On the Run. Actually, that one's just okay, but still, even the instrumental tracks here serve a purpose of pacing and are something that you learn to appreciate over time and achieve deep listening with. It's just an all-around amazing album, and I can't help putting it at the top, even if I heard it way too many times. I've gained like 1,000 subscribers in a month. Thank you. It's all from my Beatles video though. Stop watching that. It's old and cringy. Watch this instead. Anyway, I'm about to start making money from my channel. I'm gonna become corrupt.